Hey everybody, Andy here with Precision, and today I'm going to show you guys how to take down this Benelli M4 as far as we possibly can. So first thing we're going to do before disassembling any firearm is obviously make sure that we're nice and clear. So breech is open, everything's out of there. On these, there's a couple different things you can do to start with, but first thing I always like to do is actually remove the barrel and the ARGO system on here. So what we're going to do is just untwist this cap here, set that off to the side. Now the barrel, the forend, everything basically comes off all as one, other than the magazine tube. We can just keep on sliding that right off of there. Now be careful though, because these are loose on here. There's just a little bit of a lip that's actually inside this lug, but as you guys can see, they really just fell out. It's two pieces on. Set that off. We can put these four ends off to the side. I'm going to go ahead and take this receiver set, the receiver, trigger, all that. Just set that off to the side for now. I've got this impact weapons dismounting bracket for my TLR. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Now this gas system that's on here is known as the ARGO system. Benelli, when they designed this, they actually made it for field stripping as few tools as possible. So these little holes here are actually sized to actually be able to use the charging handle. Okay, so all we're going to do is we're actually going to pull the charging handle out, just like so. Now this charging handle, as you guys can see, actually just fits inside of these lugs here, and all I have to do is just rotate it to the left to loosen them up. I'm going to go ahead and do that to both of these. Okay, now that we have those caps off of there, you can take these pistons here and these just slide out the front, just like so. Now inside of here there are some holes. You guys probably can't see them here, but what happens is as the shotgun gets fired, the gases come up through the holes inside the barrel, one hole per piston that's on here. That piston then is actually sent back, and the piston itself hits the bolt and cycles the firearm. When you go through and clean this, obviously get as much fouling out of the barrel as possible. There really is not anything to lubricate on this barrel assembly. You actually do not want to lubricate the pistons. You want those to be left dry. Benelli even says that straight from the factory. The reason for that is obviously grease, oils will attract dust and dirt. Believe it or not, gunpowder residue is a dust and dirt. So leave these nice and clean. It will cycle and you shouldn't have any issue with it. Now, these caps on here are actually overpressurization valves. Inside of here, there's a plunger, a spring, and basically a cap in there. Now, you guys can also see this pin that's running through here. What happens is, obviously, that spring is under compression right now, and it's being held in there by that pin. What we're going to do is we're going to actually take this apart real quick. Now, in order to do that, my bench block actually has a really nice hole where I can take the threads. The threads go through the hole without hitting anything, but it actually rests on the shelf of this cap. So I'm just going to put that in there. Now what I'm going to do is take my screwdriver and I'm going to hold my punch in the other hand as I am applying pressure to that cap. I'm going to take that punch and push it through. Now these pins that are running through here are shouldered, so you got to push down far enough to get through that. Now it's not a very large spring, it's not going to come out on its own, but it is under a lot of compression, so you have to make sure that you're not just going to let something fly. Now this is the pin for it. As you guys can see, it is shouldered on each side. Set that off to the side, and then as we dump these out, you guys can see that there is basically a piston, the spring itself, and then this cap that goes over it. So we're just going to set that off to the side for right now, and we'll get those cleaned up. Alright guys, so once we've got everything cleaned up, reassembly is going to be obviously the exact opposite of disassembly. So we're going to take our actual cap, drop in the plunger. Next we will put in the spring and the piston. Then we can take our pin, and as you guys can see, obviously we still have to depress that plunger. So what we're going to do is take our screwdriver, punch, whatever you're deciding to use, depress, push that through, and then again, since those pins are shouldered, there we go. So that's one. As you guys can see, it's nice and shiny. Set that off to the side. Do the second one. There we go. There's both of our caps and our pistons. Now we can go ahead and get everything reassembled back onto the barrel. So again, reassembly is the exact opposite of disassembly. We're going to take our pistons, put the long side here back towards the receiver. Slide that one in. Slide in the second one. Now there are O-rings on here. I didn't take these out, but you can. It's literally just a rubber O-ring, so you can pull that off and slap it back on there. So because those O-rings are on there, putting these pistons back in, or these caps, can be a little bit of a pain, but just roll a little bit of pressure into it, and putting it back in really isn't too terrible. Just get those finger tight for now. And once you have these finger tight, you can take your charging handle again, put that in there, and just kind of snug it up so you know it's not going anywhere. There we go. I like to use charging handle. Obviously that's what Benelli developed these to be able to do, and that's really it for the ARGO system. Now, little function check, just make sure your pistons can move easily. No resistance there, hardly whatsoever. And now I'm going to go ahead and put my bracket back on here with my light. Okay, we will just set this off to the side. Now as far as removing the bolt, super easy. First thing we're going to do is just pop out the charging handle. It's literally held in there. There's a little D10 spring, and that's it. So we can take the charging handle and set it off to the side, and then the bolt literally just slides right out the front. Nothing special to it. Now this bolt, we'll get into how to actually disassemble that next. So here's the bolt and carrier. Now the only thing that you really can't remove from this, from the factory, is going to be this arm here, and the only thing that's holding it in there is this pin. However, you guys can hopefully see the stakes from the factory that are in there. So can you drive it out? Yes. Do you need to? The factory obviously thinks you don't, so I'm not going to. Now, in order to actually disassemble this entire bolt and carrier assembly, what we're going to do is push in on the firing pin on the back here, and we're going to pull this pin out. Now they are loose. I won't say it's completely loose, but there's really not a whole lot of force holding it in there. Honestly, it's not even really friction other than this O-ring that you guys can see running around there, actually riding against this lip on the bolt carrier itself. So we're just going to set that off to the side. Now the firing pin slides right out. Set that off there. The spring comes out as well. Set that there. Now the other thing holding the bolt in is going to be this little lug. So all we're going to do, just very gently grab it. Again, not much force holding it in there at all, just a little bit of friction. And then this whole bolt face comes right out of there. Now, the only other thing that is inside this carrier itself is going to be this detent ball. There's a spring and a pin in there. Now, what happens is, is as this is sitting inside the receiver and your charging handle goes through, that little click is actually coming from that detent ball on the back, and it's just indexing on this little notch. So we're going to set that off to the side. All we got to do is just drive this pin out. In order to remove the pin, detent spring, and detent, what I like to do is actually chuck it up in the vise. As you guys can see, the back side of it here is nice and flat, so I can get a good purchase on it. And then all I'm going to do is just drive it out using a hammer and punch it's in there. Now it is very tight. A 1/16 punch is extremely tight in there. So if you have something a little bit smaller, it might be good. It's not under a lot of tension, but it is obviously under something. So keep that in mind as you're drifting that out of there. As I drift this out, the pin is still being held in by the kind of the back side, or basically what's in between the pin and this inner bore of the carrier. So I don't really have to worry about that going anywhere. Now if I wanted to, I could just grab a pair of pliers and yank it out, and I will in a little bit. However, before I do that, I want to make sure that I'm not going to be losing this spring that's down inside of there. So that's why I've left the punch in there. Now what I'm going to do is keep my finger over this hole as I pull this punch out, and then in theory I shouldn't lose that spring. Now that I've got that out of there, what I can do, the spring is still in there. Again, it wasn't under a lot of compression, but it was obviously enough to allow that detent to work. So now I can just dump that out of there. There's my little spring, so I'm going to set that off to the side, and you guys can see just a tiny cute little bugger, little shoulder on the end of it, and just round it off on the side that actually faces the charging handle shaft. Set that off to the side, and now at this point the entire carrier assembly is disassembled as far as you're going to want to take it. If for whatever reason this arm were to get damaged, cracked, something like that, you've probably got bigger problems. Me personally, I would probably just call it Benelli or one of my suppliers and get a new one. At the very least though, if you just want to drive this pin out of here, you can. You're obviously going to have to break through the stakes the factory put in there, so just keep that in mind. All right guys, now here's the actual bolt and extractor. Now I have zero hope that my camera is actually going to be able to get down inside of there to actually show you this. However, there is a roll pin that is holding in the extractor itself, okay, and there's obviously a spring back behind that extractor. Now what I'm going to have to do, if you guys look, that pin is not accessible from the top, right? It's not all the way through. Instead, what they want you to do, I can see a little bit of a glimmer of it there, they actually want you to take a punch or a drift and set it inside of there, and you're basically just going to hit the side of that roll pin, okay? And then eventually that's going to come out far enough that it will allow this extractor to come out. So we're going to try doing that here. Now, we're going to do this. We're just going to set that right there. I'm going to take my punch, and I can feel a little bit of a lip in there, but I'm going to go with a slightly larger punch, I think. This is a 3/32 punch, and I wish I could get one slightly larger, but any larger than this and it won't actually fit into the hole, at least with my punches. My camera shut off unexpectedly, so hopefully we can work this out. But anyway, so inside of here, as I was saying, there is only part of this roll pin actually exposed. So what I did is I took a 3/32 roll pin from right here, which is just smaller than the actual hole, but still big enough where I can get a decent purchase on the side of that roll pin that is exposed. Was able to drive out the roll pin about as far as possible. That still was not far enough for me to actually drop this roll pin past the extractor. So we're gonna take this roll pin, push that down as far as possible. Now this is a 1/32 punch, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put that down in there. Now there's obviously the hole from the roll pin itself, and just put that inside the hole, send that out, and you guys can see it's starting to come out a little bit more there. I'm still not going to be able to get all the way down with this punch, so what I'm going to do though is get it as far as I can. Now this pin is out a decent amount, you can see it's still not allowing this extractor to come out. So what I'm going to do is grab a pair of pliers here and basically just work it out of there back and forth. Keep my thumb over the extractor and the spring until I can feel just a little bit more pressure on my thumb. There we go. Now, there's no real reason to take this pin all the way out, but you could if you really want to. Now, the extractor, just like most other extractors, looks like that, just a little pivoting piece of metal, and then the spring itself. So, and that is as far down as you can take this bolt. The rest of this is just a chunk of metal. Reassembly, as always, is going to be the exact reverse of disassembly. So just put those back in there. And take my hammer. That pin is back through that hole now, but you can see it's not quite all the way in there. So I'm going to take my 3/32 here. And there we go. That's now flush with that little shelf in there. So now the bolt is done. Now, as far as the carrier goes, we got to remember to put that detent back in there. So about the only thing I really use the vise for at this point is going to be just for this little detent pin. So what we got to do is put the actual retaining pin in there first, just to hold it, because I know I'm not going to have 3 hands later. Now guys, what I like to do is actually hold the pin with a small pair of pliers, because I value my fingers. Keep the pliers up and out of the way, and all we're trying to do is just get it started in the hole to the point that it's going to stay in there with just a little bit of friction, but not impede dropping anything into this hole. In this scenario, with it assembled as is, we're going to take our little detent, and as we discussed earlier, you guys can see there's a shoulder on the top and a little ball face on the bottom here. We're going to take that ball face and put it down so that it faces the hole that the charging handle goes into. I'm going to take a punch here and just kind of push that down. If we look, hopefully you guys can see there is now a little detent right inside that hole. And now we're going to take spring, drop it in there, and then I'm going to take my 3/32 punch, and I'm just going to push that down, the actual spring, while I tap that pin. Now the pin itself is obviously going to stop by the punch. So all I'm trying to do is grab half of that spring while I tap the rest of this in here. There we go. 2 sides obviously to this pin. Both are very important. You want to make sure that it's slightly depressed from the outside as well as from the inner bore, so that neither side is obviously going to catch friction from that pin. Now from here, we can go ahead and start reassembling the rest of the bolt and the assembly. So first thing we're going to do is take our bolt, make sure that we have this aligned properly. Now the extractor is going to go towards the side that says Benelli Army System on it. Rotate this up. We can see there is the pin for this little retainer here, this indexing pin. Take that and drop it in. Now on this pin, we can see that there is a line. That line goes to the front. Take our firing pin spring, slide it in the back side, take the firing pin, slide it in the back, and then the only thing that we have left is going to be our actual firing pin retaining pin. So again, we're going to push the firing pin in, slide that through, and there we go. Now on mine in particular, it actually came from the factory. This O-ring is no longer in pristine condition. I do have a little chunk of it taken out. It does allow me to slide this in a little bit easier. But with that, again, this pin is just being held in by friction. So again, we're going to push in the firing pin, push that down there, and our bolt is reassembled. Now we're on to the receiver itself. Now the receiver, although it's easy to maintain, and Benelli did a very good job at being able to maintain it easily in the field, it is still fairly complex. So feel free to pause and do whatever you need to do in order to follow along. So first thing we're going to do is, again, as I talked earlier, I'm not going to worry about taking this off. I've already got it sighted in. There really isn't any reason to remove. This is actually the Scalar Works mount and a Trijicon MRO. In order to remove this, I'd actually have to remove the optic, and then I can remove the 4 bolts that are attaching the rail to the receiver. So Anyway, what we're going to do is, first off, and this is probably as far as most people are going to take it, would be to actually remove the trigger assembly and the firing control assembly. So again, Benelli, in their infinite wisdom, made it so you can take the charging handle and actually drive out the pin. So that's what we're going to do. Now that pin on the back side here, you just grab that, pull it out, and then just grab a hold of the trigger guard and just kind of rock everything out of there, and it comes right out. So we'll set this off to the side. It's actually very rare that I completely disassemble it for maintenance or anything like that. There really isn't any reason to, and that's the reason that Benelli made it the way they did. So we'll actually take this and set it off to the side for right now as well. So guys, this pin right here, I like to just push back in most of the time, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to remove it. So you guys can see there's obviously a little C-clip right there. All you got to do is take a pair of snap ring pliers, put them in there, and hopefully, if this cooperates with me, there we go, pull that out, and then this whole assembly pulls right out. Now there is also this little retaining spring. Again, just for the purpose of the video, that's the only reason I removed it. So what we're going to do is we'll actually assemble everything outside of the hole. I just want to make sure that the notch on this pin goes inside. I'm going to call it the hole in the E on that spring. Set that down in the hole. There we go. Take that washer, push it down. There we go. And the snap ring. Take that, compress it, push it down as well. And then I like to take a screwdriver, just push everything down, just to make sure it is actually in the notch. So there we go. Quick little function check. Yep, it stays in, we're good to go. Now guys, another thing that the vise is nice for is being able to actually remove the stock from the receiver. So super easy. Once the trigger is actually removed here, all you got to do is actually take it and literally just unscrew it. Comes right off of there. So this brings us to the recoil tube. There is inside of here a snap ring, as well as a couple slots here for screwdriver. So first thing we got to do in order to remove this spring and the plunger and everything is actually remove this snap ring. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So now that we have that snap ring out of there, what we're going to do is actually just take this, there's a threaded piece in there that's actually holding in the spring itself. So we're going to go ahead and start loosening that up right now. Now a lot of these, from what I'm reading, mine is for sure, is that these are actually only about finger tight. When it comes from the factory, I believe there's a little bit more tension on it, but that is, a lot of that is just because, like this one in particular was completely packed with grease when I first got it from the factory. Benelli, when they ship it, they have no idea how long it's going to sit on a shelf in the armory, and want to make sure that they're obviously protecting it from rust and all that. So we're going to not completely back this out yet. Now that we know that the tension isn't too much on the end of this, what we're going to do is we'll actually take a punch and put it up. So looking up on this, you guys can see there's a couple holes here. We're going to put a punch inside of this hole, and what that's going to do is help retain this spring inside of here and hopefully give us a little bit of a chance to not lose, you know, the spring or anything out of here. Just keep a little bit more control. Again, I'm just going to hold that in there, use my thumb to pull this out. Now there is obviously a little bit of tension on there. You guys can see there's that little screw cap. There's a shoulder on the back side where the spring goes, and then it's countersunk on there. So you guys can see little notches for where the screwdriver would normally go if for whatever reason you actually need to use one. So we'll just set that off to the side for right now. Now you guys can see the spring is in there. I'm going to keep my finger on the end, my hand on the end of it, pull that pin out, and then just slowly release the tension on it. So now that this comes out, set that off to the side, and then this is actually the plunger that comes out. Now this is the part that actually touches the arm on the back of the bolt carrier assembly. That off to the side. And then as far as this goes, I'm not going to take mine off of here. I do know that this is Loctited from the factory. You're supposed to heat it up, torch it. I would always recommend a heat gun. You always have a lot more control with the heat gun than you do over a torch. And then this nut on the back here is actually a jam nut. They Loctite it, jam nut it on there. This does not come out easily at all, and I really just don't want to risk damaging anything. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that in there. Now reassembly again is going to be the exact opposite of disassembly. Going to take our plunger, obviously put the cup side in towards the receiver, take our spring, push it in there. Now you guys can see, just to give you an idea, the spring itself is a little bit longer than twice as long as the receiver tube, so you guys have an idea of how much compression is actually on the spring. Go ahead and push that in there. I'm going to go ahead and get my pin, so I know I'm going to want it. Have my cap ready, sitting right there. Take the spring and compress it as far as possible. Find that hole again here. Push that up there. That obviously retains the spring a little bit. Take my cap. Again, it is shouldered on one side. Take that shoulder, put it nicely into the spring, and then just start walking it onto there. So once it's in there at decent ways, it's actually already lost tension on the punch itself, so I can pull that out before it falls out, and then just keep spinning this in there by hand. Take my screwdriver, just kind of snug that up, make sure it is bottomed out, which it is. Then I can take my C-clip here, grab it, press it, slide it in there, and then release it. Alright guys, you're probably getting sick of hearing about C-clips, but there is at least one more on this shotgun, and that is the magazine spring retainer clip that's on here. So again, we're just going to take a pair of snap ring pliers, push that into the hole, compress it, and then this entire cap comes out. Now again, it's not a ton of pressure, but it is obviously under some. So we're just going to set that cap off to the side. The whole spring comes out, and then from the inside we can actually break out our follower. Okay, again, that's really it as far as the magazine tube. So we're just going to slide that back in there. Clamp that back up into the vise, put our spring in, take the cap, and guide everything in there without binding up. And you just want the cap to basically be flush with the end of that. So that's it for the magazine tube. So as far as the bolt catch, bolt release, whatever you want to call it, the only thing really holding this in here is going to be this pin. Now this pin, you're going to drift it out from the bottom, and then what that's actually holding is your release, which as I push this, you guys can see pivots on that pin, and then there's a spring back here as well. So all we're going to do is just drift that pin right out of there. As you guys can see, that pin is now hanging down right there. So I'm just going to leave that hang there, set my tools down, and then I can grab the spring and actual catch out of there. So guys, now I have my catch and my spring, and I'm just going to set those off to the side, and then I can take this pin, just wiggle it out by hand. Really wasn't in there very tight anymore. Set that off to the side as well. So guys, that's basically it then for disassembly on the receiver. I think the only other thing that you might want to remove would be this rear sight, which again, there's really no reason to ever remove that I can tell, unless you significantly damage it somehow. But if you did want to remove it, it's literally just a couple straight head screws that are holding that in there. Nothing too difficult on that. So now that we have that C-clip off of there, now we get to take this pin out. Before we do that, however, we need to relieve pressure off the hammer spring. In order to do that, what we're going to do is make sure our finger is on the hammer, take the gun off of safe, so now we're in the fire position, and basically decock it, letting that hammer come forward in a controlled manner. You don't want to just pull the trigger. This hammer can fly up, cause damage. That's literally just a plastic housing, so just want to make sure you're safe with that. Now that that spring compression is off of there, now we can take this pin right out of there. Now this pin not only holds the lifter itself, the hammer, it also holds on the carrier stop lever. Before we take this off of there, we also need to remove this spring. All you got to do is lift up, let it roll back behind that stop lever, and there you go. So now this just kind of moves freely. Now it is still holding down that cap for the hammer. What we have to do now is I like just take a punch, put my finger on the back side just to try and keep it a little bit more controlled, and just start pushing that pin right out of there. It's not under a ton of pressure or anything like that, but what we're going to do is now just kind of pull that out. There's the pin itself. You can see those indexing slots that we were talking about earlier the C-clip goes into. Set that off to the side. We're going to take off the carrier stop lever. We can then also take off the lifter. Now the lifter, when we roll this up, I didn't do that just for theatrics. Because of the way that everything is molded, you can't just pull it out. Basically leave it pivoting around there. You can rotate this all the way down and then pull it out. Now this pin is also in there. This pin has to be put in. You can see there's a shoulder on the side. It has to be put in from the inside to the outside on this lever. Okay. There you go. So pretty simple. There is, obviously, to accept that shoulder, it is counterboard inside of there, so it's really the only way to actually put it back in there. So I'm just going to put that pin in there for now, just to hold it there, set that off to the side, and now the hammer can slide right out. Pretty simple, standard hammer. Now the trigger is integral with the disconnector, or vice versa, however you want to word that. All we're going to do is take a punch, push the pin out of there. Now I do have my finger holding down the disconnector. You can see there is a spring in there. The spring is actually up inside of this housing. Just take the pin, set it off to the side. Now when we lift this trigger out of here, again, there's a spring up here, but there's also this pin back here. This pin is basically just a pivot point for the trigger. It's not actually holding anything in there. So what you want to do is push the trigger forward just a little bit, and then you can rock this up. And then there is our trigger spring. Now I'm going to show you how to actually take this disconnector out of there. Just like with pretty much anything else on this firearm, there's a spring inside of here, down inside of here, and there's a little plunger, push, whatever you want to call it, that actually applies pressure to the disconnector here. So if I pull this back, you can see it just returns on its own. So what we're going to do is take this pin out. In order to do that, I'm just going to take a punch. Because of that spring tension there, on mine anyway, I do have to use a hammer. Pops right through. I'm going to make sure that I keep pressure on everything as I pull this punch back out of there. There we go. Disconnector comes up. Set it off to the side right there. And then this little plunger and the spring. Okay, and then there's a little hole inside the trigger itself. So I'm going to go ahead and reassemble this real quick. Again, this definitely isn't something I do on a regular basis. Now, when I go to actually put the disconnector back on, the way that I like to do this is you can see this little finger sticking up right there on the trigger. What I'm going to do is basically put the disconnector down in there, catch it on the front of that finger, and then just rock it down. And then you can see it still doesn't quite line up that hole, but it's pretty decent. I'm going to grab my pin here, get it set. And then I can flip it over, try and line everything up, and then actually just push down on that pin so it pushes into the bench block, and now it's captured. So make sure it's flush. Needs to go a little bit further. There we go. Can't feel it, so we're good to go. So now we'll set the trigger and disconnector aside. Now as far as this back pin goes, again, like I was saying earlier, it actually doesn't hold anything in there as it's sitting right now. All it is basically a pivot point for the trigger. So if you really need to take it out, gets damaged, whatever, you can just take a punch, push it through, and it pops out. So same pin as the actual pivot pin for the trigger up here. Now, as far as the safety on the back goes, again, it's very simple. All you have is the safety itself. There's a little detent, little cap in there, and a spring pushing down. And then in order to retain all that, there is just a little roll pin right inside of here. So all we're going to do is drive this out. Now, the spring and detent are under I'm going to call it a decent amount of pressure. Again, not enough to cause any major problems, but enough to actually send that spring out and put you on a little scavenger hunt. So just be aware of that. So all I'm going to do is I'm not going to take this pin completely out. There really isn't any reason to. However, right now the spring is being held in by the punch itself. So all I'm going to do is put my finger over that hole, pull the punch out, and everything is still down inside this hole. And we'll go over to the bench to show you guys the rest of it. Here's that pin that I was talking about. Obviously the safety is still in there. All we're going to do is flip this over, the spring, detent pop right out of there. And then at this point the safety is just being held in there by friction. So we can kind of twist that out of there, and there's your safety. So so now that we're all chucked back up in the vise here, what I can do is take my safety. I am right-handed, so I'm going to put this so that the button is on the right side of the trigger itself. Push that right in there. Next up is our little detent. Drop that in. Drop the spring in. Now obviously the spring is being held in there, or once everything's done, that spring is going to be held in there by this pin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a punch that's just a little bit larger than the ID of the spring, just so that the punch doesn't slip down inside of there. And then all I'm trying to do is basically capture half of that spring, because obviously the punch is going to stop the pin from going all the way through. So now that I've got that, I can go ahead and tap that all the way back in there. Use the same punch. Make sure that I am flush on the side, which I am, so we're good there, and our safety's back in there. So next up, I'm going to go ahead and put in this rear pin that the trigger is going to pivot against. And as you guys can see, I can send that home almost all the way with my fingers, but it's not quite flush, so I'm just going to tap that in there. So guys, now we can go ahead and put the trigger back in. Now I like to do this part on the bench as well, just because this spring, when we put it in there, it's not being held in by anything. Okay, so my preferred method is to flip this whole thing over, hold the spring in there just by gravity, and then basically slide the housing over the top of it. Now, as we discussed earlier, there is this back pin that basically rides inside of this little notch here. So what we're going to do is kind of put this in there. We're going to make sure that notch goes over this back pin, and then we can rock this back. Now, the easiest way to make sure that everything is lined up is obviously the spring is not bound up or anything, and this hole in the middle, hopefully you guys can see that, is clear. Okay, if this trigger is not on this back pin, that hole is not going to be clear. Next thing we need to do is actually put this pin back through the hole there. And what I like to do is actually flip it around and put it in from this side. Okay, and the reason for that is because this spring needs to go on at some point, and I find it's easier to put that on last. So what we're going to do is get that hole fairly close. I'm going to take this pin, push it through, and it just so happens to line up. Now, one thing that I've come to find out is that if it doesn't line up quite right, what I can do is actually grab my bench block, flip this over, and actually push it down on the bench block. There's no major tension or anything on this, or no major friction, so it slides in there pretty easily. So now you guys can see there is this little gap right here on the side. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this spring, if I flip everything over here so you can see it a little bit easier. We're going to take this spring and set on there. Now this little curly Q goes up, as you guys can see right there, and then this little loop needs to be facing down. So all we're gonna do is slide that down there so it lines up with the hole, push the pin through with your finger on the back, everything's flush, that spring is in there, and then I like to take it and just kind of flip it up on top that little ledge right there, that little finger. So now the trigger and disconnector are back in there, as well as this spring. All right guys, so next thing that we get to do is basically assemble the front portion of our fire control group here. So first thing we're gonna do is take our hammer spring, drop that there, take the hammer spring cap, drop it in there. Then I'm gonna take the hammer and set it in there. At this point, it's just being held in there by friction. Next up, we're gonna take our lifter here. Again, making sure that the pin is in there, it is recessed, and it's going in from the inside of the lifter. Now, in order to do this again, we're going to kind of angle it down and then rotate it into place. Okay. Now, it does want to kind of fall off of there, so you're gonna have to hold it. And then what we're gonna do is take our carrier slide stop here. Then I'm gonna take the pin, push it through, and then we can line up the holes on everything here and basically just start pushing it all together. Next up is going to be the hammer. As far as friction goes, it goes together much easier than it came apart. Obviously, the hardest part is just trying to line everything up. Now, if you guys look, there is a little finger here. There is a little finger here on the carrier slide stop. So what we have to do is actually push this down while applying pressure in on that pin, and then everything just kind of locks into place. Okay. Now that hammer spring cap is now under compression, and the only thing holding it in there is that little finger on the stop lever. Now that we have that, we can really just let it go because there's enough tension in there to hold everything in place. However, just to be safe, what I want to do is take my little C-clip here and actually put it back onto this pin. Now again, there really isn't a great way to do this. This is a very strong C-clip. Now guys, one way that I have found that kind of simplifies the process, it's still not exactly easy or fun, but one easier way that I have found to put these C-clips on is to actually use a universal driver. It's just big enough that the pin can fit inside of here, but it's also large enough to sit on the C-clip when we push it on. What I'm going to do is try to line up you can see the little prongs inside of there, try to line those up with the slots on the pin itself, and then I'm just going to take this driver and try to kind of rock it onto the pin while I hold the back side of the pin with my thumb. Unfortunately, I can't really get good camera angle here. So now that C-clip is basically just sitting on the outside of that pin, now I can just take a little screwdriver and actually continue to push it on there. Basically just until it clicks into place. I don't think you guys can hear that, but I felt it. Now what we can do is we got to put that spring back over the slide stop lever. So what we're going to do, push this down just a little bit, grab that spring, flip it over the front, and now it's on there. Now we can take the hammer, cock it back, make sure that we're in safe. Quick little function check. Make sure you keep your finger over the hammer itself. With the safety on, we can't pull the trigger and fire. When we pull the trigger, the hammer does release. Keep the trigger pulled back, lock it down, and the disconnector does engage it. When we let go, it doesn't go anywhere. So there we go. Now the last thing that we need to put in is going to be that little spring shaft for the lifter itself. So first thing we're going to do is take our washer, slide it into the little slot right here. Okay. Take our spring, put the shaft inside of there, and then I like to get the end into the spring first. Take the lifter lever here, bring that up as high as possible, and then it's super easy just to pull that shaft back a little bit to get it inside of there. And then our function check for that is literally just try to lift up on the lifter. It goes back down, so we're good to go. So that is the disassembly and reassembly of the fire control group. So by now you guys have probably figured out that reassembly is essentially the exact opposite of disassembly. So first thing we're going to do is slide the buttstock back on and just twist it on there. Now as soon as you start feeling tension, don't try to over torque it. The fire control group, the trigger housing, will actually hold it in place. All I try to do is just line it up, make sure it is nice and flush and squared up to the receiver. So next thing we need to do, guys, is get this shell stop put back in. So what I'm going to do first is take my hammer and a punch and get this pin just started here. Doesn't need to be in there at all, other than just to be held in there by friction a little bit. Make sure that I'm not feeling anything on the back side. Then I'm going to take my actual stop lever, make sure that it's lined up, make sure the button's in the hole, take the spring, get it into place on the back side. Now while I'm holding that in place, once I get a little bit closer to the receiver, I'm going to take a 1/16 punch. I want to have that just set just below the receiver here so I don't feel that. That feels good to me. I think we're okay. Now while everything is upside down, next thing I like to do is put in the fire control housing. That just kind of wiggles in there. Sometimes you need to push in on the shell stop just a little bit. And there we go. So now your trigger's back in there. Make sure you leave it on safe just so you don't accidentally damage something. From there, take the bolt carrier assembly, line it up, push it in there. Simple function check, just make sure it goes all the way back. If it doesn't, most likely your arm is not lined up with the plunger. And then from there, all we got to do is put in the charging handle and we're good to go. Go ahead and just leave that locked back, and then we can move on to reassembling the barrel and the gas system. One of the last things we need to do now is actually reinstall the barrel and gas system onto the receiver. So with this, there's a couple different ways that I've seen guys do it. My preferred way is to get it almost all the way assembled before I put the foregrip on. So what we're going to do, slide the lug over the magazine tube here, get the chamber and barrel extension lined up and almost all the way on there into the receiver. Now these also have right and left actually imprinted onto them, so all we got to do is make sure they're both facing the same direction. Arrows face forward, and you guys can see these are pushed about as far up as I can get them into this lug up here. In order to capture everything, I need to then slide the barrel, gas system, obviously the barrel and gas system are one at this point, and the foregrip all down at the same time. I just have to slide everything into place all at once, make sure that my front lug, right up next to the magazine cap, is on the actual magazine tube. Make sure that my foregrip is not only locked into each other, there is basically a tongue and groove connection right in this joint here. Make sure that the front is indexed and properly attached to the mid lug, and then line everything up with this back plate. Also make sure the pistons are lined up with the receiver, and then just slam it all back into place. Now in order to truly lock it, you need to essentially just put that cap on there and basically just hand tight. Don't want to ever torque it down with a tool or anything like that. You guys could hear that little ticking sound. There is a little detent, little ball detent that locks into or grabs into these teeth on that cap, try and keep it in place. So other than that, guys, the only other thing that I haven't shown you so far is the choke tube. Just like any other choke tube, I'm just going to put it in there, rotate it to the left, loosens it up. Now again, this wrench came from the factory. Really nice wrench actually. It is actually the first one I've ever seen with these little teeth on there. And what those teeth are, it's actually a thread chaser. So let's say that I get some crud in the end of that barrel. What I can do is just put this in there. By no means is it a a tap or anything like that. It's definitely not sharp enough to do that, but it is sharp enough and clean enough that I can go through, get any fouling, dirt, dust, whatever out of those threads before I put my choke tube back in. Pull that out, go put the choke tube back in, and then use the wrench to snug that back up. So from there, simple function check. There we go. So as you guys can see, that is the complete disassembly and reassembly of the Benelli M4. If there's anything that I missed, any questions you guys have, please let me know below. As always, appreciate you guys subscribing, liking, sharing. Really helps us out. Doesn't cost you guys anything. And yeah, it really helps out the channel. So anyway, as always, thanks guys, and we'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.